All right, Rabbi, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. We are Meretz Hashem, continuing today. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, to thank Mrs. Bracha Shimber, excuse me, for dedicating all the Shimmer and Drushos this month in memory of her husband, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi Zichron Lebracha, to thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating all the Shimmer and Drushos this month in the Schus of Refuah Shalema. For Shulam Bas Susha, to thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Yehuda and Bracha Buchwalter, in memory of Usher Zelig ben Yaakov Yehuda Halevi Buchwalter, whose Shloshim is this Friday, the 3rd of Adar. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas will have an Aliyah, the families in Nechama, and all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Chole Yisrael. Shabbos says, so today's daf is Chof Zayin 27, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem. Let's actually pick up a little bit on Chof Vavam base 26b. So we have a very interesting sugya ahead of us today. Let's pick up. Amrli Rav Simi Bar Ashli Rav Papa. So it's 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom. So if you remember again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit. So let's discuss where we started, and bless you, and where we are. Where we started, I will say, was this concept in the Mishnah that we had about a person going out, in this case, a woman designating certain karbanos, certain animals for karbanos, for neder naziros, in satisfaction for neder naziros, only to have her husband be made for her neder. So we began to get into this idea of what do you do with animals which have been consecrated but now are no longer needed. So it was there that we made a fundamental distinction between what we called mifurashos or stumos. Namely, that there's a difference between a case where animals have been actively identified for a specific carbonic purpose versus when they've just been grouped together to be used for karbanos. So when animals have been specified for a specific carbonic purpose, then halacha l'maisa, they're utilized for that carbonic purpose. So chatos is always the outlier of this, because a chatos, again, has to be left to die. But ultimately, again, ola could be offered up as an adava, a shlamim could be offered up as an adava, and that's the halacha. The same concept ultimately applies to money. If you just leave a pile of money to satisfy carbonic obligations, then halacha l'maisa yiplu l'nedava, right? It goes to the nedava fund. If you go ahead and you've specified this money should be for chatos, this money should be for ola, this money should be for shlamim, then ultimately, again, chatas money, what always happens with chatas money? Yiplu yamamelach, right? And the other monies ultimately are used to satisfy their respective carbonic obligations. So what we saw in yesterday's daf was a bit of a continuation of that same concept. Let's pick up over here. Amar of Silber Ashli Rav Papa. My tanayu dirabanan. What's the logic of the Rabbanan? So we'll say, so ultimately, again, the Rabbanan are of the opinion that it's only money that has this din of stumos, but nothing else. Nothing else. So the Gemara says, what's the logic? The Amri Ma'os v'lo behema, v'lo naska, Ma'os v'lo savra. So we'll say, because again, the Rabbanan hold that it's dafka din in money. It's dafka din in money and not animals. It's dafka din in money and not beams. Remember, again, that was the case we ended off with in yesterday's daf. Elami'ata Ma'os v'lo ofos. So we'll say, maybe you should say that it applies only to money and not to birds as well, not to bird pairs as well. So the Gemara says, maybe you'll say indeed that is the case. So amai, hamos, so we'll say, since I listen to this. So now the Gemara says as follows, Kinin is a bird pair. So remember again what happens. You bring your bird pair to the kohen. I will say, if you take a quick look at the rush. So the rush is on the right-hand column. Look at the bottom, it's 4 lines up from the bottom of the rush. So right-hand margin, not a column, right-hand margin. So the rush says over here, Elamiata ma'os v'la'ofos kilomar hamafrish kan l'chovaso. Here's the case, we'll say, a person goes ahead and separates out a bird pair in order to satisfy his carbonic obligation. V'lo piresh ezo la'ola, ezu li'ola, ve'ezu l'chatos. And he has not identified which bird is going to be an ola and which bird is going to be a chatos. Okay, he hasn't done so. So what's the halacha? Kidi Israel, Mishay Mischayiv chatos v'amahare alai ola v'hefresh ma'os v'amra el lechavasi Ratzi lahavim chatos, ratzi lahavim chatos, lo yavi ola. So lo yavi ola, lo yavi mishum shechashvina la kimefurash ve'ein yadua lima. Hachanami kevan dechashivasa lekol davar mefurash chutzimo. So what the Gemara is asking is like this: if you accept the premise of the Rabbanan, which is that everything is considered to be mefurash, everything is considered to be explicitly identified for a particular need, if that's indeed the case, with the exception of money. In other words, most like we're going with the idea of the Rabbanan, that the only thing that could be susum, that's stumos, the only thing that could be unspecified is money. Let's go with that assumption. Then ultimately, again, that same logic should apply to bird pairs as well. Let's finish up the Rush. He says, Im kain kishehivrish kan l'chavaso havi kimafurash ve'ein havdavar yadua v'lo yuchlu habaylim or hakoin levaram shema yeshna me'ola lechat sheni yeshana me'ola lechatos ve'meis yemustabos. Listen to this. So if that's the case, according to the Rabbanon, that the only item that can ever remain unspecified is money, but everything else is considered to be specified. So in reality, how are you ever able to really bring a bird pair? Because we'll say if you bring a pair of birds, then lemaisa, again, one of them is for a chatos, one of them is for an ola, but again, they're considered to be like mifurashos, they're considered to be like explicit, and therefore, again, really what you'd have to do is you'd have to be concerned that both of them are the potential chatos. So how could you ever do anything with them? So the Gemara says, but yet we know, but yet we know that halacha lemaisa, the bird pairs can be specified, either ultimately at the time when the owners purchase it, or at the time when the coin actually performs the garban. Amai hamaos gemirinla. So we'll say, but 1 second, but halacha lemaisa, that kinim, right? Kinim should have the din of mifurashos, and ultimately, how does the kohen have the ability to identify each one for their particular purpose? Top of Chav Zayin, Amarle, Ulatamech, Hadisnan, that's which we learn. Shimon Gamliel says, Hevi shalosh behemos, velo piresh. So we'll say, listen to this case, another similar case. Now, this is all in the Rabbanan. So remember again, the Rabbanan are of the opinion that the only thing that could ever be stumos, that could ever be unspecified, is money. Everything else, by definition, is going to be mifurashos. Now, both sides, so just understand where does that cause a problem? Where does that cause a problem? That'll cause a problem anytime you have a chatos involved, right? Because remember again, chatos is the one thing that could stare everything else, because at the end of the day, unspecified chatos really requires everything to kind of be set aside for non-use. So now the Gemara says it's following. What about the following situation? Person brings three animals. V'lo piresh, but he did not identify which animal is going to be used for what. Now I will say, take a quick look at the Rush again. The Rush, in this page, Chav Zayin with Aleph, is on the left-hand margin. That was you're going to have to go down for a little while in the Rush. You see Tosos Ulata'amech. See that Tosos? If you move to the left and go about 8 lines up, this is like ways. Right, go to the left, go about 8 lines up. In Meretz Hashem, you'll see the Rush. Ulata'amech. The Rush says, the Mosesli, the Behema va'ofos, Havustumin kimomos. Shabbos say the Gemara says ha disnan hevi gimel behemos kivsa the keves va'ayil. Here's the case: person brings three animals. A female sheep, a male sheep, and a ram. 3 animals. Okay. Now the Rush says velo piresh ela amar elu lekarbanos nezirusi. Now both say, so what happened? The person brings 3 animals: a female sheep, a male sheep, and a ram. And he doesn't identify which animal is for what. All he says is these animals should be to satisfy my carbonic obligation for Nazirus. So what's the halacha? Back to the Gemara. Haruya lechatos tikrav chatos, liola tikrav ola, lishlamim tikrav shlamim. So mostly the animal that is fit for a chatos should be offered up as a chatos. The animal that's fit for an ola should be offered up as an ola. The animal fit for a shlam should be offered up as a shlamim. And I will say now, just to show you which animal is assigned to which, take a look at the Rush once more. The Rush says, Haru'ya lechatos is the kivsa. The chatos is the female sheep. The ola is the keves, the male sheep. And ultimately, again, the shlamim will be the ram. Shabbos says, so now watch this. The Gemara says, Va'amai. But why does this work? Ha'amrit behema lav kimifureshes damya. But one second, they will say, 1 second. You just said before that according to the Rabbanon, behema is not mifureshes. What does it mean it's not mifureshes? It's stumos. It's unspecified. So if it's unspecified, take a look at the rush once more. I'm sorry for making you keep going back and forth. Va'amai, va'amina behema lav kimufureshes damya. V'chevan shelo piresh chatos ola ushlamim heich kraven below kriyas shame. And I will say, here's the problem. So the Gemara makes it sound like over here that what could happen? You're a Nazir. You show up to the Beis HaMikdash with your 3 animals. You say these, right, my male sheep, my female sheep, and my ram. And you say these karbanos should ultimately be for my Nazirus. For my Nazirus. The Gemara says, it works. Right? It works. It works. Why? Because ultimately, again, like the Rush pointed out, we'll go ahead and we'll use the female sheep for the chatos. We'll use the male sheep for the ola, and ultimately we'll use the ram for the shlamim. For the shlamim. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Why does it work without specification? You just said before that halacha l'maisa, everything in life has a din of stumos, unspecified, except for money. Except for money. If that's the case, shouldn't we require explicit specification of each of the animals before they're offered up as part to satisfy your kabbanic obligations? Read the Rush again and both say, listen to this. V'amai farminon behema lav mifuresh. Let me see that Rush. The cheven shelo piresh chatos olo shlamim heich kraven below kriyas shem. So how can you offer up these karbanos without explicit identification? Ella vadai kimu. So actually, this is already the answer. So the Gemara says, Ha'amr Amrle Hasam V'lakach V'asa Amrachmana. So actually, we'll say, truth is, take a quick look at the Rush again. I'm sorry for making you go back and forth. Let's just read the answer inside. He says, Ella Vadai Kimefurash Dami Kilu Perish Chatos Ola Ushlamim V'nikva Akol Echa L'Shem Mashayeruya. So the Rush says it must, I will say, that when you show up to the Beis HaMikdash and you say, right, you bring 3 animals, a male sheep, a female sheep, and the ram, and Allah Lamaisi, you say these karbanos are for my naziros, that it's as if you're saying what? It's as if you're actively identifying each animal for each specific karbanic purpose. So therefore he says, Uleidach perish hachikus. Fine. So we'll say, let's step there, back to the Gemara. So the Gemara will say, so here's what's interesting, just to show you what's going on over here. If you notice, a fascinating distinction. In the bird pairs, right, when you show up with you show up with a bird pair, both say, what has to happen with the bird pair? What has to happen? At some point in time, each of the birds must be explicitly identified for their particular carbonic purpose. Now, there are 2 intervals at which carbonic identification could occur. What are the 2 intervals? Either at the time when the owner purchases the birds, or at the time when the Kohen is about to do the avoda with the birds. But there must be an explicit identification of the birds. Contrast that with the case we just saw over here. We'll say what happens. I'm a Nazir. I show up at the Beis HaMikdash with my 3 animals, right? A male sheep, a female sheep, and a ram. And I say, these karbanos are for my Nazirus. Then we'll say, what happens? What happens? Each karban is utilized for its own particular purpose, right? Without what? Without what? Without an explicit identification of each of the animals. So what's going on over here? Why by the birds do I need explicit identification? This bird's going to be for this bird's going to be for this. But yet by the 3 animals for Naziros, I don't. To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you, it's different. Amrle Hasam, v'lakach v'asa amrachmana. I will say there by the birds, the Torah goes in and identifies 2 key points. 2 key points in the avoda of the bird offerings. V'lakach, the time of the purchase, that's done by the owners. V'asa, that's the time of the avoda. So, I belekichas bailim, I ba'asiyas kohen. So we'll see, when it comes to the offering of birds, the Torah identifies 2 pivotal moments. V'lakach, the time of purchase. V'asa, the time of the hakrav, the time of the offering. And the Torah Kedosha tells us that again, at one of those 2 points in time, the birds must be identified for their particular use. So we'll say one more rush before we turn the page. Last rush on the page. Left-hand column, 3 lines up from the bottom of the rush in the wide lines. Amrle v'lakach v'asam rachmana kilomar osivas lecha me'ofos shekol echad mehem roi lechatas ola ola v'afilu hachi am rachmana v'lakach v'asa shimlo biru habaylim b'shas lekicha yachal hakohen levarer b'shas asiya ama havi kistumin. Shabbos says, so listen to this. So the Gemara understands as follows. The idea is birds, and we're going to see in just a moment, we're going to say the birds are identical. The bird's identical. And therefore, again, either bird could be used for a chatos, either bird could be used for an olah. So the Torah therefore goes out of its way to identify that they're stumin, they are considered to be unspecified, and therefore the owner must do something to be able to identify which bird is going to be for which purpose. Now again, there are two intervals at which you could do this identification, either v'lakach, at the time of the purchase, or v'asa, at the time of the avoda. So the Gemara says, hachanami, Amid Bezer will say. So the Gemara says, mi matzis amris, hadin chatos tikra vola. So we'll say, so here's the beauty of this. Why is the case of the Nazir different? So we'll say, it's actually a very simple answer. Let me tell you this outside before we get into it. Why is there a very simple answer as to why there is a distinction between the bird pairs? So we'll say, just to crystallize our question, right? This is all in the position of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say the only thing that could remain sussum in this world is what? The only thing that remains sussum? Money. Everything else by definition has to move first. So we'll say, so now we're contrasting two carbonic cases. We have the case of the bird pairs, where the Gemara is telling us that you must actively identify which bird is going to be the chatos, which bird is going to be the olah. Contrast that with the case where the guy shows up after his neder naziros. He brings three animals: male sheep, female sheep, and ram. And halacha l'maisa, what happens? He doesn't have to identify them, and we are each offered up for their respective carbon. Why the distinction? So both say the Gemara essentially gives a very simple distinction. Why the distinction? In the bird parable sign, either bird could be used for what? Either bird could be used for either thing. It's the same bird. Remember again, they're identical birds. So either one could be used to the chatas, either one could be used to the olah. I will say by the karbanos of the Nazir. Listen to this. As the Rush pointed out before, I will say, what's the halacha? As you can see in the Gemara, mimasis amris hadin the chatas tikra vola. I will say by the Nazir. Remember, you bring a male sheep, a female sheep, and a ram. Why three different kinds of animals? Because the three karbanos, ochatos, ola, and shlamim, require three different types of animals. Hacha nikeva, achatos is the female sheep. Hacha ola, hacha zachar, the ola is the male sheep, and therefore the shlamim ultimately is going to be the ram. So both say, do you know why you don't have to actively identify the karbanos by Nazir? Do you know why you don't have to? They're self-identifying. I know that's a loaded term contemporarily, right? In other words, right, the ram identifies as a ram and the sheep identifies as a sheep. Everybody's identifying the way they need to be identifying. So both say, so just want to point out over here, that's the fundamental distinction. And the truth is, it makes a lot of sense. So now, the Gemara just says it's not a din in stumos or mefurashos. The way it works by Nazir is you have three distinct animals for three distinct karbanos, and no other animal could be used for the other type of carbon. In other words, they both say you can't go ahead and bring a nekeva, right? You can't bring the female sheep for the olah, and you can't bring the male sheep for the chatos. So therefore, and the ram for the shop. So therefore, I will say because it's explicit just in their gender designations, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, there is no need to explicitly articulate. Masha'in came by the bird pairs, it's the same bird. Therefore, the Torah says, "V'lakach v'asa." At some point in time, you have to go ahead and identify which bird is going to be used for what. Incredible. So, Master Rav Hamnuna raises a kasha. So, we'll say now, Rav Hamnuna is actually going back to something we mentioned before. Umi amrinan behema balas mum kistuma damya. That was safe. Remember again, there was a statement on Chavava Medeis that we saw that Allah Chalamaisa a behemoth ba'mum, right? A behemoth that has a mum and therefore cannot be offered up. But remember again, even a behemoth with a mum still retains sanctity. So that a behemoth ba'mum has a din of a stuma, right? Has a din of unspecified. We'll call it unspecified animal. So the Gemara says, is that true? So let's analyze this. So Tashba. Ketzad is a very interesting case. So we'll say, Ketzad Amru, Ha'ish Migalech al Naziros Aviv. Now we'll say, what is the case where a person ultimately, again, now we'll say, the Lashon over here literally is, he takes his haircut or his shaving on the Naziros of his father. What it's really going to mean is, what's the case of where a son could potentially use the Naziros Karbanos of his father in order to satisfy his own obligations. So, listen to this. Bisman Shaya, and I will say the Bach changes the girsa here. It's Bisman Shaya Aviv Nazir, Vehifrish Aviv. Take out who? So it's Bisman Shaya Aviv Nazir. So we'll say here's the case, right? We'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain has a father, Yaakov. Yaakov, the father, was a Nazir. And what happened? Vehifrish Aviv Ma'os L'Naziruso. And ultimately, so Yaakov, before he died, separated out money for his Nazirus, for his Karbanos, for Nazirus. Okay, now what happened? Umeis. Then Yaakov died. He died before what? He died before ever being able to offer up his Karbanos. So he dies. So now there's this pot of money. Umeis. Va'amar harini Nazir. So we'll say now, Ruvain the son says, I'm a Nazir. Now, the truth is, the Rosh says, Ruvain actually became a Nazir even when his father was alive. So the Rosh brings out, his father was alive. Okay, so what happens? The point over here is, Ruvain says, I'm a Nazir. Amanas she'agaleach al ma'os abba. So we'll say, so Ruvain says, listen, my father died. He had set aside money for his Karbanos Nazir, for his Karbanos Naziros. I am a Nazir, and I'm going to satisfy my Neder Nazirus utilizing my father's funds. What's the halacha? So hayulamos stumos. So we'll say, so now essentially the Gemara says like this. Let's look at the kind of funds that Yaakov, the father, left over. If he left over ma'os stumos, we'll say again, so what are ma'os stumos? Unspecified, meaning that Yaakov just set aside a pile of money. He said, this money is going to be to satisfy my carbonic obligations in the aftermath of my Nazirus, but he did not what? Specify X amount of dollars for chatas, X amount of dollars for olo, X amount of dollars for shlamim. So what's the halacha? Yiplu l'nedavim. The entire amount just falls to nedava. Haisalo behema mefurashas. And I both said, I watch this. What happens if instead of money, Yaakov left over animals? But we'll say, but what did he do? He explicitly identified animals for different things, right? This animal should be my chatos, this animal should be my ola, this animal should be my shalom. So what's talacha? So the Gemara says, chatos tamus. So again, the chatos animal is left to die. We know that already. Ola, tikrav ola. The ola animal should be offered up ultimately again as a nedava for ola. Shlamim, yikrevu shlamim. And ultimately again, the shlamim animal should be offered up as a nedava for shlamim. So the Gemara will say, my lav, afilu balas mum. Are we not talking about even in a case where let's say the animal that he left over is a balas mum? Is that not possible? To which the Gemara says, lo, tamima. Now we're only talking about unblemished animals. I have a balas mum, kistuma damya. I will say, but if he left over a balas mum, right, an animal that cannot be offered because it has a mum, then it will be the halacha. That will be treated like unspecified funds. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, my area mos, then why even go ahead and frame the case as dealing with money? Lema, let it just say, haisa lo behema ba'alas mum. If he left behind an animal that was a ba'alas mum, yiplu l'nedava. Ultimately what? It don't fall to nedava. So what the Gemara is suggesting over here is, why does the Brisa go ahead and start with a case of money, then transition into a case of animals? Just keep the whole thing a case of animals. And if you want to illustrate the case of unspecified funds, just go ahead and use the case of a blemished animal. Because you're saying that a blemished animal ultimately again becomes l'nedava. Yiplu nedava. Hachenami balas mum l'may kadisha lidmei. Enachnami, you're right. And I was about to say it's the same case. When you have a balas mum, what is a balas mum sanctified for? Or I was about to say, how does that sanctify? What do you do? With a sanctified balas mum? What do you do with it? You sell it or you redeem it. In other words, so the idea over here is that a balas mum animal has the din of monetary sanctity. Right? It doesn't have kedusha, it has kedushas damim. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, hainu mos, it's the same case as money. Fine. So Masiv Rava raised another kasha. I'll point out this case of a son using the case of a son and a father and a son who are nazirim at the same time, and then ultimately the father having separated out money or animals for his neder nazirus, and the father having died before the conclusion of his end of Nazirus, the ability of the son to use his father's karbanos is actually a separate sugya. We're going to, it's daf lam. We're going to talk about that in Mirat Hashem. Really fascinating topic. The Gemara is just bringing it over here kind of tangentially. It's more fast. Masiv Rava. Rava raised another kasha. So karbano. I'm sorry. Where are we up to? Yeah, good. So the Gemara says follows. Masiv Rava. Karbano. So we'll say the pasuk said just the Gemara. Oh, hold I love chata sasha chata vehevi karbano. Person will bring his karban. So let's listen to this drasha. Karbano bekarbano hu yotze ve'eno yotze bekarban aviv. The boss says it's actually a fascinating Gemara. Gemara says in general, karbano teaches you that when you have carbonic liability, whose karban can you use to satisfy your carbonic obligation? Your own. Your own. But you cannot use someone else's karban to satisfy your obligation. Listen to this. Karbano bekarbano hu yotze ve'eno yotze bekarban aviv. Ultimately, again, you could be yotze with your karban, but you cannot use your father's karban. So I will say, let's analyze this halacha for just a little bit. Really, really quite fascinating. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Yachol lo yetze bekarbano shel aviv shehefresh min hakala ala chamura or min hachamura ala kala. So I would have thought like this. Maybe when can't I use my father's karban, for example? When what? When let's say my father separated a karban because he needed to atone for a more severe sin. So I can't use that karban to atone for a lesser sin. Or vice versa. My father separated out to atone for a lesser sin. I can't use my father's karban to atone for a more severe sin. In other words, what the Gemara is floating is the following havamina. When can't you use someone else's karban? I will say, when can't you use it? Perhaps when the original, when the karban was set aside for the type of aveira which does not match my liability. Either because the original aveira was more severe or less severe. So when you have dissimilar liabilities, that's when I can't use someone else's karban to atone for my aveira. However, aval yotze bekarban shefesh avav min hakala ala kala or min hachamura ala chamura. I will say, but perhaps if the liability matches. In other words, let's say my father went ahead and separated out a karban to atone for what we'll call a relatively lesser transgression, and I also have a lesser transgression. Or he went ahead and he separated it for a chamura. I also have a chamura. Perhaps in that case, because it is similar liability, I should be able to use someone else's karban. Talmud lomar karbano. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says karbano bikarbano hu yotze ve'eno yotze bikarbano shel aviv. We'll say if you want to achieve atonement in life, you could only use your own karban. You cannot use the karban of your father. Yachol lo yetze bekarban aviv bebehema shehifrish afilu min hakala ala kala min hachamura ala chamura shari ein adam megalech al behemas aviv benazirus. Shabbos say so fine. The Gemara floats another havamina. I might have thought, when can't I use my father's karban? I will say, when is that? Ultimately, again, that's when my father specifically identified an animal. So if my father specifically identified an animal that he's going to bring for a particular liability, whether, again, I have a more chamer liability, a less chamer liability, that's when I can't use his karban. When halacha l'mais, again, he explicitly identified the karban he needs to bring. However, so that's when we say, Shahare ein adam megalecha behemas aviv benizirus. Aval yotze b'mos shehifrish aviv. But I will say, maybe if my father didn't separate out an animal, but what did he separate? What did he separate? Money. So maybe if by money, ultimately again, afilu min hachamura ala kala, or min hakala hachamura. So I will say, but maybe halacha l'maisa, if my father just separated out money, maybe I could use his carbonic money for my own liability. After all, because as we're going to see, Shahare Adam Megalech al Maos Aviv Benaziros Bizman Stap of Chavchas Bizman Shein Stumin Velo Bizman Shein Mufurashin. Because Shabbos says we're going to see. Shabbos says so. What? Watch what's happening over here. The Torah says karbano. Shabbos says karbano is a possessive phrase, meaning when could I achieve atonement? I could achieve atonement with my karban. With my karban. So the Gemara says, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? So I might have thought about saying, so first havamina is, so that's teaching me, I can't use my father's karban. And by the way, Father is just an example. What it really means is you can't what? You can't what? Use anyone else's carbon to atone for your own issues. So I will say, so the first Havamina was, when can't I use my father's carbon? Maybe that's in a case of dissimilar liability. Right? Let's say my father transgressed the kala and I transgressed the chamura. So when there's dissimilar liability, that's when I can't use. But perhaps if we have actual like symmetrical liability, then perhaps again I can use his carbon. Kamash malo no, carbon no. You can only use your own carbon for atonement. Fine, that's case one. Okay, I would say Havamina number two is, when can't I use my father's carbon? When can't I use it? When my father actually separated out an animal. So he actively designated an animal to satisfy his carbonic liability. That's when I cannot go ahead and use my father's carbon to satisfy my own carbonic liability. However, if my father set aside money for carbonic purposes, then what? Perhaps I should be able to use that money. The Rabbi will say, why? We have precedent for that. What's the precedent for that, Rabbi will say? That Allah Chamais in the case of Naziros, and we'll see this on Daf Lamed, in the case of Naziros, if my father, right, if Reuven has a father Yaakov became a Nazir. Yaakov went and separated out money to satisfy his Karbanos Nazir. Then what happened? Yaakov dies before he has the opportunity to include his Ned in Naziros. So Rabbi will say, what's going to be the halacha? The halacha is that as long as that money is stumin, unspecified, Reuven, the son, could use those monies to satisfy his obligation. If they're mifurashim, you can. So what do you see from here? There's precedent that maybe when the Torah says karbano, what does karbano mean? You can't use someone else's designated what? Designated animal. But you can use someone else's designated monies. Because we have precedent for that. Talmud Lomar, we'll say top of Chavches 28a. Second line down from the top. Talmud Lomar, karbano. Bekarbano yotze. Ve'eno yotze bekarmanav. Therefore, what does the pasuk say? Once again, the pasuk says, karbano, your carbon. You can only satisfy the obligation with your own carbon, cannot satisfy the obligation with the carbon of your father. Let's just do one more section. This goes on actually until the Mishnah on the bottom of the daf, so we're not going to go the whole way. Excuse me. Yachol. Lo yetzi. So therefore, we'll say, so far, here's what we have. Carbon number one teaches me that what? Number one, I cannot use someone else's designated animal. What else does carbon teach me? I can't use what? Someone else's designated money. Now the truth is, Naziros might be a little bit of an exception for this, but in general, you can't use someone else's designated sacrificial money in order to provide for your atonement. I will say, Yochol, lo yetzimimo shehifrish afilu minakala ala kala minachamura ala chamura. I will say, now watch this. Now this case is interesting. I might have thought that Allah Maisa, I can't use money, right, that my father separated, shehifrish afilu minakala ala kala or minachamura ala chamura. So we'll say, so let's say, so now what we've established is fine. So I can't use my father's animal. I also can't use my father's money. Even if what? I'm going to use the money for the same type of carbonic liability that my father had. My father transgressed the kala, I'm going to transgress the kala. Rabbi say, people have different forms of Yerusha from their parents, right? So, right, my father transgressed, I'm going to transgress, right? So the mice again. So what happens? Even if it's symmetrical liability. Watch this. Aval yotze bekarban shehifrish liatzmo minakala ala chamura or minachamura ala kala. They will say, watch this. Now watch what the Gemara just did. What about the following situation? Let's say I designated an animal for a particular chait, and now I want to switch the use of that animal from one type of an aveira to another type of aveira. Now, I will say in this case, I'm repurposing what? My own carbon. I might have thought that should be permitted. Talmud Lomar, karbano al chatoso. So therefore, both say the pasuk says your carbon on your chet at shehei karbano lushum cheto. So we'll say ultimately again halacha lemaisa. I'm only allowed to set aside a carbon for one particular aveira, and once the carbon has been set aside for that particular aveira, it cannot what? It cannot be repurposed. Now, I will say, I want to point out, don't confuse this with the case of Tamura, right? Because Tamura is something different. Remember, what does Tamura involve? Exchange. So 2 animals. That's not this case. In this case over here, I realized that, you know what, I purposed an animal for an Avera Chamura, or a Kala, and then I realized, you know what, I have an Avera Chamura that I also have to atone for, so let me just switch this over to the Chamura. So in other words, it's not a Tamura case, it's just a repurposing and a designation case. So I will say, so 3 cases. What do you see? Case number 1 was ultimately, again, my father set aside an animal for a carbon. Then again, Yaakov set aside an animal for a carbon, then Yaakov died. And then ultimately, again, Reuven wants to use the carbon. The Gemara says, carbano, you can't use it. Case 2. Yaakov set aside money for carbonic purposes. And now Yaakov died. Reuven, the son, wants to use it. Carbano, can't use it. Case 3. Reuven went ahead. Reuven, the son, went ahead and designated an animal for Avera A, and now wants to go ahead and repurpose the animal for Avera B. What's the halacha? Carbano? Can't do it. And I'll say, what do you see? What do you see from here? Right? What's the Musar Haskell? The Musar Haskell, I will say, is that if you want slicha v'chapara, right? Remember again, we spoke about this, that chait, in general, generates a dual form of liability. Every single sin has dual liability. There's onesh, there's punishment, and there's tumah. And there's an impurity as a result of sin. Therefore, again, I will say, how do you atone for chait? Chait has this duality. There's kapara and tara. Kapara, atonement, takes care of the onesh, takes care of the punishment. Tara takes care of the tumah. It's this duality. That's why I will say, that's why technically speaking, we know this. You could take care of the onesh relatively easily, right? How do you take care of the onesh of chait? How do you take care of the onesh? No, interesting enough, the way you take care of the onesh is carbon, right? In the base, right, is carbon, right? The onesh is the easy part. In other words, kapara is the easy part. Tara, remedying the tumah of chait is the much more complicated part. That's tshuva. Right? Bringing a carbon is relatively easy. It's a behavioral mechanistic act. Costs you a couple of shekel, right? But at the end of the day, it's relatively easy in its performance. Kapara takes away the onesh, done. The tara, which takes away the tumah, is tshuva. So we'll say, what are Chazal teaching us with this Rosh of Carbonel? What are they teaching in Carbonel? What's the takeaway message? Takeaway message I will say is, if you want tara in life, you have to do it yourself. If you want tara in life, there is no such thing as piggybacking on someone else. Tara requires rolling up your sleeves, taking ownership of the entire process from beginning to end, and fundamentally, profoundly changing who and what you are. And guess what? You can't rely on your father. You can't rely on your mother. You can't rely on your Rabbi. You can't rely on anyone else. The process of Tara requires you to take absolute ownership over the direction, trajectory, and focus of your life. And that's why, again, but my father left over money. No. That'll work for kapara, not going to work for Tara. My father left over an animal. Okay, that'll work for kapara, won't work for Tara. I will say, not only that, I already started on something. Let me just repurpose it for the... Doesn't work. I will say, Tara works. Tara works if you're willing to build something from the ground up. I will say, do you know at the end of the day, right? Think about this just a moment. It's Shvat. We're almost in Adar. So I'll say, you remember Rosh Hashanah? Anyone remember Rosh Hashanah? Right? So I'll say, you remember all the promises I made to myself on Rosh Hashanah? I remember all that stuff. And I will say, if you're like me, hopefully, again, some of them you're living up to, but chances are a good number of them you're not. Ever wonder why that happens to us? Right? Why does that happen? Why does that happen at the end of the day that I just don't come through on the promises I made to myself on Yomim Noraim? I will say it's not because I don't care. And it's not because I really don't want to do it. It's because it requires more effort than I thought it was going to require. You see, I thought like there'd be an app, right? Or there'd be a hack, right, of some sort, right? In other words, there's got to be a workaround. There's always like a backdoor, right? There's always like a way to do it. And then I suddenly discover that the truth is, for personalistic growth, there's no app, there's no hack. All there is rolling up my sleeves and hard work day after day. And what do I say at some point in time? Like, I'm just tired. I'm just tired. I just really don't feel like putting in the effort. That's really what it comes down to. But it's not that I don't care. It's not that I don't care. It's just that it turns out to be so much more work than I thought it was going to be. And I will say that's the drasha of Carbano. Carbano says, you want something in life, specifically, you want Tara in life, Carbano. It's you and only you. It's got to be 1,000% of your effort. It's got to be 1,000% of your resources. It's got to be 1,000% of you pushing you. You can't rely on your father. You can't rely on this. You can't rely on that. It's got to be all you. But if you make it carbano, if you make it all your effort, then there is no telling what level of tara, what level of kedusha, and of course what level of kapara is waiting for you as well. So we'll stop over here for today. I'm stopping in kind of like in the middle of this drasha. We're not finished with carbano. Let's just do a few minutes of Mesilas Yesharim together. All right, Rabbi, we are continuing Meretz Hashem in Perek Chav Daled in Mesilas Yesharim. Perek Chav Daled Mesilas Yesharim. So we'll say, so just to reorient ourselves just for a moment. Just for a moment. So if you remember again, the Ramchal introduced us in this Perek to three different types of Yira. Three different types of Yira, right? Remember again, let's quick Chazara. What was number one? Number one? That was number two. Actually, number 2A. What was number one? Yiras ha'onesh, right? What was Yiras ha'onesh? Fear of punishment. Most elementary level of Yira. I don't want to get patched in this world, in the next world, and therefore, again, I'll keep myself in order because, again, I don't want to get punished. I will say the next level up from that was Yiras haromimus. What was Yiras haromimus? A recognition of the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then on Friday, the Ramchal introduced us to, as Greg just mentioned before, Yiras hachet. And I will say now, what's Yiras hachet? What's Yiras hachet? Yiras hachet, interestingly enough, is a general, almost like fear. I don't even like to use the word fear, like a consciousness of my actions. I'm constantly aware of the way that I'm living and what I'm performing to make sure that there are no elements of hate, no elements of sin mixed into my behaviors. So I'm constantly thinking before I act, after I act, while I act, about what I'm doing, the way I'm speaking, the way I'm acting. Is there any element of hate that is laced into these behaviors? And I'm vigilant to make sure that there is none of that there. That's Yiras hachet. So now the Rabbi Ramchal says as follows. I'm actually going to start one line before today's assignment. He says, so we'll say obviously that there is a connection between Yiras hachet and Yiras haromimos. Ki atachlis b'shneim, because the tachlis, the purpose of both of them, shalasos davar neged rum kvodo yizbarach. Obviously, the goal is not to transgress the Dvar Hashem, right? So we'll say, as opposed to Yiras ha'onesh, where the entire purpose of onesh, right? What's Yiras ha'onesh? What is Yiras ha'onesh? Yiras ha'onesh is, I don't want to get punished. That's it. That's the sum total of it. I just don't want to get punished. Yiras haromimos and Yiras hachet are much more sophisticated. Here, I have an appreciation and a God awareness. I recognize that I exist within the purview of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I want to make sure that my behaviors are not offensive to the Ribbon Shalom. Yiras hachet, I want to make sure that my actions are beyond reproach. So look at it. Ha'hevdol b'shneim. So we'll say the Ramchal says there's a profound difference between them. What's the profound difference? Sheba'avuro techashev kimin achar u'b'shem achar tikarei. Listen to this. Ki yiras haromimos hu b'shas ha'maisa o b'shas ha'avoda o b'perek ha'avera. Dahainu. So let's listen to this. Yiras haromimos, which is this recognition of the awesomeness of Hashem, let's say applies dafka, what he calls b'shas maisa, at the time of action. Either again, the time when I'm actually doing something, the time when I'm serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or the time when I'm committing an Avera. Dahainu, o b'shashu omet u'mispalel, o oved, sha'az yevosh v'yikalem v'yirash v'yirat mipnei rum kivoda yisbarach. So we'll say, listen to this. Yiras haromimos is actional. In other words, when is it triggered? It's often triggered in actional moments. Specifically when? Specifically, we'll say, here we go. I'm about to do a mitzvah, Baruch Hashem, right? I'm about to do a mitzvah, whatever, you fill in the blank. And then at the time of the mitzvah, what's the thought that suddenly flashes in my mind? What's the thought? Who am I performing this mitzvah in the presence of? The Ribbon Shalom. And therefore, we'll say, what does that awareness trigger? What does that awareness trigger? A much more profound performance. So now suddenly, I'm not going to be lackadaisical in my performance. I'm not going to be mediocre in my performance because I am performing this mitzvah, this avoda, in the presence of the Ribono Shel Olam. And I want it to be clear that this is being performed in his presence. So Yiras HaRomimos is triggered actionally, in a moment of action. Conversely, Obisha, Shemizdamenas Avera Lefanavu Makiba, Shiavera, Shiazamilasoso. So let's listen to this. Conversely, what else is it actionally triggered? I'm about to sin. I'm about to commit an Avera. And in that moment that I'm about to commit an Avera, what thought is triggered in my mind? What thought? Who am I about to commit this Avera in the presence of? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I'm about to say that awareness saves me from going and committing the Avera. Why I'm about to say? Because the truth is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is right here with me. It's not the pshat that like I've conquered my yetzer to do the Avera. I still want to do the Avera. But I know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is right here with me. And so I'm embarrassed to do that Avera in the presence of the Ribono Shel Olam. Man asher lo yaseh davar lamros enei kvodo chas v'chalila. So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. So therefore, what's fascinating about this is as follows. So Yiras HaRomimos, a recognition of the greatness of God, is really actionally focused. At a time when I'm doing a mitzvah, so that Yiras HaRomimos changes the way I perform the mitzvah, because now that I know that I'm in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm going to perform the mitzvah in a different way. Or I'm about to commit an Avera. Yiras HaRomimos says, I can't do this. I live in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How Rabbi say contrast that? Yiras HaChet. Rabbi say Yiras HaChet. Again, remember, what's Yiras HaChet? Yiras HaChet, Rabbi say, is an analysis of how I'm living. Like an actional analysis of everything that I do. Listen to this, B'chol Eisa B'chol Shah. Rabbi say Yiras HaChet, which again, Rabbi say, doesn't mean fear of sin. Yiras HaChet means that I examine my actions to make sure that they are free from sin. When does that actional analysis occur? This is incredible. Shnei b'chol rega hu yareh, pen yikashav v'yaseh davar achatzi davar sheyeh neged kavod yisparach shmo yisparach. The alkane, so Rabbi say, listen to this. When does Yiras HaChet, Rabbi say, occur? This is actually incredible. When does Yiras HaChet occur? When does it occur? Rabbi say, it occurs always. It occurs always. It's absolutely incredible, right? It absolutely occurs always, because I will say, at all times, I'm constantly looking and examining my actions. He goes on, he says, I'm constantly aware of my actions, and I don't want my actions to have any element of anything that is contrary to the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'yakin nikres yiras chet ki ikara yira min hachet shlo yikanis v'yis'ari b'masa machmas pshia v'yisrashlus o machmas helem ye'ezeh davar shiyer. Be'ezeh davar shiyer. We'll say, listen to this idea. The Ramchal is saying over here, Yiras HaChet means a level of actional refinement. That I want to make sure, they'll say that, right? You ever have a situation like this? I'll tell you where this comes out for me all the time. You're talking with someone, and you say something, and you think, what do you think afterwards to yourself? Why did I say that? I didn't need to say that, right? Something that's like a smart aleck, crack that you make. Like, I didn't need to say that. I didn't need to make that joke. I didn't need to make that sarcastic or cynical. I didn't need to make it. So I will say, now was it an Avera? No. But that's Yiras HaChet. Yiras HaChet is a person who's just always looking at what they're doing and just trying to figure out, is it refined enough? So therefore, I will say, which is incredible. So whereas Yiras HaRomimos is triggered by specific actions. When I'm about to do a mitzvah, when I'm about to do an Avera. So I'm about to do a mitzvah, Yiras HaRomimos says, you're about to do a mitzvah before the Ribono Shel Olam, make it good. Or I'm about to commit an Avera, I say I'm in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I can't do it. Yiras HaChet is an ongoing, rolling process, where everything I'm doing, right, the way I talk and just the way I act throughout the day, I'm constantly trying to put that under a lens and ask myself, Should I talk this way? Should I act? Not sinful. Nothing to do with sin. That's just an ongoing for say. This sounds a lot like what that we learned before. It sounds like a lot like what? Zehiros. Excellent. Sounds a lot like Zehiros, which I will say it's not an accident because the truth is everything in life stems from Zehiros. That's really what it is. This awareness in life, this ongoing awareness. Here, he's talking about a different level of awareness. He goes on, V'hinei, al zen ne'emar, about this it is said, Ashrei adam mefachei tamid. Praiseworthy is the person who is always afraid. And I will say, sounds like such a depressing pasuk. A person should always be afraid. So I will say, sometimes pachad doesn't have to mean, cowering in the corner. Pachad also just means like an awareness, right? Praiseworthy is the person who is nervous about acting in an inappropriate way. In other words, I'm living life with a constant vigilance and awareness about what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. Pen tamun bhu l'raglav v'lo nishmar. See, I will say, what's the greatest danger? The greatest danger often is just kind of getting like habituated in life, becoming a creature of habit. And as a result, like I talk a certain way, I behave a certain way, and I don't really ever stop to think, is this the right way to go about things? So Ashrei Adam Mefachi Tamid, praiseworthy is the person who hits the pause button and just thinks about things as they're unfolding. Val Yiraz, we're going to finish up. Val Yiraz Zos Amar Moshe Rabbeinu Alav Shalom Bavur Tia Yirasa Pnecham Levilti Techato Ki Ze Ikra Yira Shia Adam Yorei Umizdazea Tamid Ad Shelo Tasser Yira Zumi Menu Ki Ayidei Zeh Vaday lo yavo lidechet bim yavo kaonese chashev. So I will say, now listen to what Ramchal is saying, and this is really incredibly profound. So therefore, again, this whole idea of yiras chet, says Ramchal, this whole idea of yiras chet is at the end of the day, an awareness, just an awareness. I want to make sure that the way I behave, I want to make sure that the way I conduct myself is appropriate, is good. And I want to live life with a constant vigilance and awareness about the way I'm conducting myself. Because if I am proactively aware, then I could essentially prevent chait from occurring, missteps from occurring. So therefore, I will say, if we just bring this together, it turns out, so now we understand the three levels, right? The three levels. Level one, yiras ha'onesh, which is, we'll say, we all start there, right? We all start there. At the end of the day, why does the child listen to his parents when he's a little boy? Why does the little boy listen to his parents? He doesn't want to get patched, right? He doesn't want to get patched. He doesn't want to, okay, that's how we all start out. But the goal ultimately is to graduate from that. Level up from that, yiras haromimos. Yiras haromimos, recognition of the awesomeness of God. But I will say, when is yiras haromimos triggered? When is it triggered? Dafka in moments of mitzvos and averos. I'm about to do a mitzvah. I'm doing a mitzvah, the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I better make it good. I better make it good because it's in the presence of God. I'm about to do an Aveira. How could I commit an Aveira if at the end of the day I'm in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And then there's Yiras Chet. I will say, what's Yiras Chet? Yiras Chet is just an ongoing heightened sense of awareness and vigilance about the way I live. And just to constantly analyze again what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, to make sure that it's appropriate. And I will say, when does Yiras Chet occur? When does Yiras Chet occur? All the time. All the time. I will say, it sounds like a very tall order, but imagine if we can get to that level of Yiras Chet, where literally I'm analyzing, analyzing again, the way I speak, the way I act, every moment, every day. Imagine how much tsar and how much chet we'd save ourselves. We'll say shkoyach. We'll stop over here for today. Incredible start to the week. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone.
The famous game about the Yiras Hashem Pesif Chaim. The girl says the Mishnah. Yiras Chet. It's not like the other Yiras because you're not afraid, like scary.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Okay, so we'll be in touch. Anyhow, we're coming here to
okay.
see you tomorrow.